Good morning, good afternoon. It's quite a, it's always a privilege and honor to chair webinars for Chatham House, but this is for me an especial privilege and honor to talk about US priorities in the global economy in conversation with Secretary Jacob Lew, Jack Lew. We are at an historic moment. I don't know if we realized what an historic moment it would be when we agreed the date with you, Secretary Lew, but it certainly is as leaders from across the world travel to Glasgow. I think, if I'm not mistaken, that you are speaking alongside in separate venues as our president, President Joe Biden. And certainly you're going to be speaking to us about a range of issues and on the back of the G20. For those of you who don't know, I'm sure you all do, but nonetheless, I shall introduce Secretary Lew. He is currently, I'll start with the part that matters the most to me, visiting professor of international and public affairs at Columbia University, where I am also an alum. So that's quite exciting. You are also managing director of Lindsay Goldberg, but of course we know you as the US Secretary Treasury from 2013 to 2017 during President Obama's administration. Before that, you were White House Chief of Staff, and you were twice Director of the Office of Management and Budget, both for President Obama and for President Clinton. You've obviously done many other things during and in between that time, including most recently chairing a CFR task force on the Belt and Road Initiative with some very interesting proposals on what the US and the rest of the world might do to respond to that. So it's wonderful to have you here today. I should say to our audience and our members, thank you for joining us. We are on the record and we will be recording. Secretary Lew, the great promise certainly for those of us living beyond America's borders, hoping for US leadership and engagement. The 4 years of Donald Trump's leadership were difficult, I think is a euphemism for what many people experienced. And the great promise of an America led by President Biden is the promise of multilateralism. It comes at an extraordinary moment. We've now seen that 5 million people around the world already have died from the COVID pandemic. We've seen the economic crisis and its varieties and its continuing. We've seen the inequalities. And the great promise, of course, is that the US will help and lead on delivering the big public goods, whether it's on vaccines, on debt relief, on climate, and any other number of measures. So as we turn to COP26, but we start with the G20, which took place over the weekend. You've had many things to say about the G20 as a forum, certainly of all the issues that were covered. What has your reaction been? I've noticed that many of my European counterparts are very critical of what hasn't come out of the G20. Maybe some Americans a bit more optimistic, but I'm curious your reaction to it and just your thinking on the G20 in general and the state of affairs when it comes to this big promise of global public goods delivery.
It's good to be with you today, and I look forward to the conversation. I think, my view on the G20, these international gatherings, is actually similar to my view on domestic politics, which is you really ought to start by focusing on what's accomplished, not on what's left to be done, because there's always work left to be done. These international meetings have gone through various phases at moments of crisis, like during the financial crisis, the gathering led to nations moving in a concerted way at a moment in time. But typically, that's not how these global gatherings go. There are moments when, in a normal time, you make incremental change. I actually think by the standard of what these gatherings have done in recent years, recent decades, with the exception of the financial crisis, there's a lot to show for the G20. You look at the agreement on corporate minimum tax internationally. When I was going to these G20 meetings, it was little more than a hope that you could get the international community to agree on that. Even representing the United States, we were kind of handicapped because we didn't have the ability to commit to our Congress following through were we to make an agreement. which made it very challenging to play the leadership role that we wanted to play to stop a race to the bottom. You look at the systematic work done in the international meetings, starting with the G7 and the OECD and the G20, to reach an agreement to end a race to the bottom, to permit both the funding of government services with a more fair distribution of tax burden, but also the vicious competition to always undercut other countries by lowering your tax rate. It puts the focus on competing on things that matter to the economy. Who's more productive? Who has a better workforce? Who has better infrastructure? Things that actually increase growth, as opposed to the kind of more, I don't know if mercantile is the right word to use, but the just sheer price competition on tax rates as a way to compete. So that's a big accomplishment. You look at the agreement on coal that came out in terms of not using coal for domestic production within the G20. Pardon me, for not funding international development of coal projects. That's a big deal. You mentioned the Belt and Road Initiative Task Force. One of the conclusions that we reached was that in the early years of the Belt and Road Initiative, there was a huge investment in long-term power production through coal through the Belt and Road Initiative. If that stops, it's a big deal. It's a big deal if countries don't put a 40-year dependency on coal in place. It would have been better if China had agreed to use less coal, but it's not to say that it isn't a step in the right direction. I think if you go back to the G7 earlier in the Biden presidency, the agreement to work together to increase the IMF units of distribution, the SDRs, to try and get resources to the countries that were poorest and most hard hit by the economic tail of COVID. It was partnered with an agreement by the largest countries to leverage that increase in the SDRs, as they're called, by sharing some of the quota that belongs to the large countries with the less developed countries, which had actually an exponential effect in terms of the increase in amount of resources that was made available for poor countries to deal with the economic aftermath of COVID. So you look at the last year, that's quite a lot for these international meetings to accomplish. Would it have been better if the G20 could have had a more resounding statement on climate? In my view, it would have been. But we're just beginning Glasgow today. I didn't realize until right before we got on that I was competing with my own president's remarks. So I don't have the benefit of hearing what he had to say. But I wouldn't reach a conclusion that because more work remains to be done, that there isn't a lot to show for the U.S. re-engaging. The U.S. withdrawing from these conversations or being a negative force in them was very destructive to having the world come together in an effective way. And it's understandable that there's a question about what is the future path of politics in America. But for the moment, I think we have a lot to show for re-engagement in these international bodies.
Thank you. And I have to say, we also didn't know that President Biden was speaking at this moment, or we would have given you the moment to hear him before you spoke with us. Still, I'm sure it will be recorded and shared, as will this. Let me, before we turn to COP26, let me ask you about, I guess, one of the big announcements. And we knew it was coming. It was, went through, as you just said so eloquently, it's sort of gone through the G7, the OECD, and then confirmed at the G20, which is that global minimum corporate tax rate. How significant is it? What is the likelihood of implementation? How will it affect the broader question of climate change financing for some, certainly in the US, domestic climate finance measures? What is your reaction to that? But I guess for many people, the big question is about, will it be implemented? It's one thing to see things agreed. So often we see things agreed. Certainly a question also with the climate finance for developing countries. But, when people go home, what is your estimation of the likelihood that this is delivered, this promise is delivered?
So I can't speak for all the countries. 126 countries have signed on, and I think we have to hold countries to their word. There were very specific negotiations. The countries that were most reluctant to sign on actually got concessions that matter to them. So there's a kind of, at least moral contract to follow through. But in the world of kind of governing, agreeing and following through don't always connect. Looking to the United States, I'm pretty optimistic that the United States is going to follow through. And I say that because if you look at the package that has tentatively been agreed to on the eve of President Biden's departure, of the major proposals that he put forward in his tax package to pay for his Build Back Better initiatives, the piece that survived most intact were the international pieces that would implement the agreement on the global minimum tax. I think if you look at the package that was released last Thursday, it's in the text. I think that package is going to pass. Might change a little on the margins, but I don't hear a lot of discussion that gets to changing the international provisions. So I think the United States is going to be one of the leaders in implementing it. I think that makes it very hard for others not to keep their word. There are consequences to not keeping your word, and there are also consequences in the U.S. legislation that penalize countries that don't keep their word in terms of what the tax implications are here, which I think is a good thing. So I am more optimistic that this is actually going to happen than I would have imagined possible just a very brief period ago. I think this is a very important, the word historic is used lightly, but this is historic because for the last 4 decades, we've seen relentless competition in the race to the bottom. And this is a moment where the countries of the world have gotten together and said, we're not doing that. We're doing it a different way. And that means that companies that have managed to escape taxation or have very low rates of taxation by shopping around for tax jurisdictions where they can get the benefit of lower tax rates are going to have to pay their fair share. And I think in a world where there's such deep resentment about inequality and a sense that things are not on the level, it's actually not just good for the fiscal consequences, which are significant. It's actually good to restore faith in the system, because the idea that liberal democracy and free market capitalism can remain very healthy in a world where there's deep suspicion that says, is this really on the level, or worse, belief that it's not on the level, that's damaging. And I think this is a step in the right direction to restoring confidence.
It's interesting when you've taken us back to last Thursday's budget, the Build Back Better budget, and I think the question that we hear time and time again, and this speaks to the question of global minimum corporate tax. It speaks to America's commitment to anything that might come out of COP26, to the announcements that have already been made on climate finance. How America's going to, in your view, under President Biden, honor those commitments. But of course, what everybody's worried about as they look back at the United States, Joe Manchin he's extremely well known. People seem to know about this man from West Virginia. People are very aware that not only after 2022, in the midterm elections, but also in subsequent presidential elections, that we might see a very different kind of leadership coming out of the United States, and that follow through on anything that the U.S. commits to is a very significant question. I mean, is that your concern? And if you parse that down, where is that concern? Is it on global minimum corporate tax? Is it on climate finance? Is it on moving forward with electricity transformations in the electricity generation or other areas?
Yeah, I think you have to separate the question of what is the future direction of American politics from the question of, is there meaningful policy change? And the place where they meet is how durable is the policy change. I think you're going to see very significant legislative action that pushes the United States towards meeting its commitments to hit the climate targets. The package includes $555 billion in investments in clean electricity, in clean fuel for cars, in the things that we have to do to reduce our consumption of fossil fuels. Now, there's a lot of focus on the fact that some regulatory provisions that would have been, say, the stick to go with the carrot are not there. It would have been better if they had stuck. We have a system where when our Senate is divided 50-50, a single vote makes a huge difference. And Senator Manchin has used his position as the 50th vote to reduce the scope of what's in the package. But he didn't eliminate it. And I think it's really important to focus on what there is agreement on. And I think that agreement gives us the ability to make enormous progress towards meeting the goal. The political question of how long will we stick to the course we're on? We came from 4 years of an administration that denied that climate was a problem. We're now in an administration that reflects the broad public view that it's something that we have to do to save this planet and for our children and grandchildren. Are we going to go back to climate denial? I certainly hope not. I don't know what the political course is, but you can look from country to country, and it's not just politicians who are talking about climate. It's normal people who are worried about their families. I was struck that the moment when China turned to paying attention to climate in a more serious way, it did in part flow from the pressure that the world community and the United States were putting on the matter, but it also flowed from the fact that people living in Beijing were scared to take their kids out in the middle of the day because the air was so bad. And I think you have to believe that denying something that's having such a visible effect on everyday life, with the rate of natural disasters being so frequent that it's almost like every 2-3 weeks you see news of something that you used to see once a year, twice a year. These are not just scientific and quantitative analyses of environmental and economic statistics. It's real life. So I actually think that you see our auto companies moving towards producing cleaner vehicles. You see our electric industry moving with or without the stick towards cleaner electric production and less use of coal. The world is voting on coal with or without leaders in terms of making choices. Now, what we have to do in terms of policy is create a world where people don't have to turn off the lights and don't have to stop getting to and from where they need to go to comply with standards. So I think you look at the things that are in the package, they help with that. So I'm actually optimistic that we're going to move in the right direction. I do think it's fair to ask the question of whether the kind of political swings in America will kind of slow down, because my own view is that if we have 8 or years of stability on the path we're on, that will start to make this question go away. I do think that 4 years is a period where there's a wait and see. And that's why it's all the more important, in my view, for the United States to engage and show what American leadership means, not just in the United States, but in the world. Because there ought to not be schadenfreude about the United States slipping. It's not as if the world order is stronger where the United States is weaker. And I think that the Biden administration is little by little making real progress there.
Thank you. I'm inspired. First of all, I agree, I have to say, with much of what you say. It's not, though, the dominant line that we often hear sitting here in the UK and sitting here in Europe. When people look back to the US Senate, they look back to even the progressives and the Democratic Party, largely in Congress, and this concern. But your comment that we need to separate politics from policy is one that I admire. I wonder about. But I want to turn, I guess, because you've sort of taken us there with your sense that the dial is moving despite the politics within the US. But of course, so much does depend not only on US leadership, but what US leadership encounters beyond its borders. And by this, of course, I'm talking very much about China. Where is China on this? And especially, you know, that big bet. If the first big bet of the Biden administration, such as I guess we read it here in Europe, is that, you know, America will help to deliver on the big global public goods together with Europe and others. The second big bet is that America can do this while competing with China on technology, while trying to deter it on questions of security and geopolitical challenges, whether it's in the South China Seas or with Taiwan. And so I'm curious your take, your thinking on, you know, whether the US has, I guess one view that I hear not infrequently is that America is going to struggle to compete with China when it comes to 5G, when it comes to semiconductor chips, that it risks getting behind on artificial intelligence because we can't direct our economy in the same way that they have their eye on the ball that we don't. So when you look at the economic strategy that the Biden administration is pursuing at home, when you think at its economic strategy, such as it's developing in the Indo-Pacific, with respect to China, how do you assess that in terms of this, you know, this big question of whether the US can compete in those key industries and key technologies as we move forward?
So I actually think that the US remains you know, the better bet in terms of innovation, in terms of adaptation, in terms of becoming the standard in both in terms of technology and in governance. And I think the tendency during the Trump administration to ask the question, have America's days passed, is going to seem like history, because you look at you know, the capacity of the American system, our educational system, our industrial base in terms of innovation, it is still second to none. And you know, China's hit some bumpy times for a whole variety of reasons, and the rigidity of its system, you know, complete control, doesn't necessarily make you more resilient or more able to bounce back when the inevitable bumps come along. I think the combination of management of the economy after COVID, and the increasing authoritarian nature of governance in China, and the increasingly you know, threatening posture in terms of the strategic issues, has caused many countries who have a great economic interest in saying China is the most important country to say we're not ready to shift from a US to a China focus. And Australia comes to mind as a key example. You know, Australia was the only major economy in the world that didn't go into recession during the global financial crisis. And it was almost entirely due to trade with China. And you know, you could say from an economically deterministic analysis, Australia had no choice. But you look at values in our systems, even with governments with different philosophies, Australia and the United States are much closer. You know, there's no country that we've been closer to either in military and strategic relationships or in terms of shared values. And I think that matters, you know, and I think that there was a period, a 4-year period, when the United States stepped back and China stepped forward. I think that did cause damage. You know, we saw in the case of the you know, Belt and Road Initiative, China moving, you know, vastly around the world to create networks of relationship and connectivity. But we're also seeing in the aftermath of it a great deal of damage in terms of fiscal conditions that are not sustainable, damage in terms of labor markets that got no benefit out of construction projects. You know, many countries didn't fully understand even the economics of their agreements. Now, one of the things we concluded in the report that you mentioned that I chaired was, you know, the United States wasn't taking a leadership role in providing alternatives. And if you need to do an infrastructure project and you have an opportunity on the one hand and no opportunity on the other, something beats nothing. And I think we need to be there. We need to be there both bilaterally, but also multilaterally. You mentioned telecom. The truth is the United States didn't have the 5G system, but there are European and Asian allies that have 5G systems. If we were engaged globally more effectively, the argument you should not do 5G because putting in a Chinese system has risks that you should avoid is a lot less compelling when you don't have a way to build a 5G system with something that doesn't create those risks. So it means we need to focus on what we do best. We need to do research and development. We need to innovate. We need to be connected to countries around the world with the best and strongest alliance system the world has ever known. Things that are uniquely American characteristics. We took a break from that. And China did step in and make some progress. But I think it's a mistake to say that the United States doesn't still have the ability to be the master of its own destiny. And that means we have to invest at home. My own view is that a strategy that's about projecting the strength of the United States will succeed much more effectively than a strategy that's designed to stop China. Truth is, the world needs a strong United States and it needs a strong China economically. We're the two engines of the global economy. And I think the idea that you have to make an either or choice is not practical in the global world. We ought to be there both with our example and with our support. And I think we now have many opportunities, including in terms of vaccine distribution, where I certainly hope the United States follows through on the commitment to play a real leadership role on that.
Thank you. I'm going to ask you one more question before we come to our audience. So please be ready with your questions. But you've in your thinking in that task force that you led on Belt and Road, in your remarks and in other settings on sanctions, you do seem to say this, which I appreciate a great deal, that the U.S. shouldn't counter China in its Belt and Road initiative, point by point, case by case. That it shouldn't do blanket sanctions, that it should be targeted, and that people should know when, or the recipients, the targets of the sanctions should know when they're going to be lifted. What do they have to do? What are the conditions under which sanctions will be lifted? So you seem to have a very clear sense of thinking pragmatically, but also strategically about the use of the different levers that the US has for influencing those actors beyond our shores. I guess with, both with, I don't know which you want to speak to because they're both such fascinating areas and big areas, but with Belt and Road, with the Build Back Better World initiative that's been sort of talked about, there's not a lot so far as we can see behind it. How do you imagine that developing? Do you think it's going to go anywhere? Right now, it feels like, like a set of words and promises, but without a kind of broader shell or broader, set of practices behind that shell.
So maybe if I could take it up to a slightly higher altitude, I think economic statecraft works well if it's tied to a diplomatic strategy and engagement where the levers are used to accomplish clear goals. It's true in sanctions, it's true in things like climate change. So when I was in the administration, the Obama administration, we made the decision that in order for the then Paris COP talks to be successful, it was critical to have China with the United States. We invested a great deal of energy into working with China to reach an agreement, which made it very difficult for other countries like India not to be part of it. And Paris, I think, was far more successful because the United States and China were there together. Does that mean we agreed with everything China was doing inside its own borders and on the global stage? No. If you went to our bilateral meetings, our list of complaints was long. We actually worked very aggressively to push back on things that we thought were wrong or unfair. But we could walk and chew gum at the same time. We could figure out how to balance the critical importance of working together on the climate issue with pressing them to get their exchange rates into a place where they were fair, with pressing them on issues like steel excess capacity. Did we solve everything? No. But as I said at the very outset, you never solve all the problems. Did we get climate to a better place? Yes. On sanctions, did we get China to cooperate with us on Iran sanctions? Yes. We had a lot to show for engagement. And by the way, in the same period of time, China reversed its exchange rate policy, which was at the time the leading irritant in the US-China economic relationship. So we made enormous progress on our biggest bilateral concern. On sanctions, I kind of have to pull it off to the side because it's kind of a separate regime that I think needs to be thought of strategically, not just tactically. Sanctions fundamentally are a way of using your economic power to compel another sovereign to change its policy. I think it's a mistake to think about sanctions as a regime change tool. We have blockaded Cuba for going on 60 years. It hasn't had that effect of changing the government in Cuba. Sanctions can be very effective if tied to diplomacy to put pressure on a country to change its policy. The Iran negotiations were the proof of that. Sanctions as a means of causing pain, I think, are a misguided tool because the victims are not the regime that you want to have change its policies. The victims are innocent people who can't eat or heat their homes. And that only has you take on baggage as doing things that are harmful, which tends to increase the nationalism in a country. So it is not a contradiction to say that you have to be able to tolerate some unintended consequences to put pressure on a regime. But pressure for the sake of pressure is very different than pressure for the sake of accomplishing change. We worked very hard to reduce the spillover to unintended consequences within a country and outside. When we were working with our European allies and with the UK on sanctions on Russia during the Ukraine crisis, it was very much on our mind that the spillover in European countries was going to be different than the spillover in the United States in terms of financial contagion, in terms of demand for dairy products and other goods, in terms of supply of natural gas. We put the pressure on to the maximum extent you could without the spillover causing more damage than the intended purpose. Now you could say, well, what did you achieve? Russia's still in Crimea, and they're still, in a threatening way in eastern Ukraine. You did get a Minsk Accord. You did have a freezing of a conflict that looked like it wasn't nearing an end. And if there's ever going to be a diplomatic resolution, it'll be out of that process. Now, Iran is in terms of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, is a better example of sanctions working. But I don't think that the Russia case is a failure. And to the extent that you would have had the United States and Europe divided, they would have been less effective, not more effective. So I could spend the whole time talking about sanctions. I commend the Biden administration for putting out a strategic framework for how to think about the use of sanctions, to really emphasize putting multilateralism first without waiving the right to do things unilaterally, to putting considerations of how to deal with humanitarian issues that flow high on the agenda. In my own view is that sanctions are a crucially important tool in a world where if you didn't have economic sanctions, you'd escalate more quickly to military conflict. My view on sanctions is what can you do to make them more effective and how to have them last for longer, not to weaken them. I'm not an opponent of using economic sanctions. I think they have to be used strategically. And I've been struck that when I have this conversation with policymakers, the people who instinctively understand that argument the most are military strategists who think that way about using force.
Because the thinking of sanctions as a tool of coercive diplomacy, of course. I mean, your comment again several moments ago when you said we have to think about policy different from politics, tricky in the area of sanctions where it feels like politics often get in the way. I'm going to come to Megan Green, but I just wanted to make one more quick response to your remark on China. Of course, I think when you talk about your sort of two-track approach during the Obama administration of, understanding that China was critical to many of the wins that the US wanted to see, but also taking a tough line. China, of course, many people will be thinking, but China has changed. China's bigger in terms of its share of the global economy. It's harder in terms of its domestic and international economic practices. It's a tougher, that same instinct seems to be driving policy in the Biden administration, but it's a tougher nut to crack, arguably, because China's different.
Yeah, look, I think this is a very difficult environment. China has changed. I think the domestic politics in China and the United States are very difficult. It's popular in both countries to ratchet up as opposed to ratchet down conflict. I think it's encouraging that you've seen a re-engagement at high levels in serious conversations. It's dangerous when you don't talk to each other. Misunderstandings and misconstruing things is a real risk when you're not in close contact. I don't think it's going to be an instant breakthrough when the leaders have a video conference in November, but I think it's a very good thing that they're going to be talking one-on-one. I was in rooms with President Biden and then Vice President Xi when he made his trip before becoming president. They know each other for a long time. That makes a difference. It's not as if that's going to change, President Xi's view of what the future of China is or his ideological views about China, but perhaps it will open a space for some closer dialogue. And if it leads to better cooperation on some of these transnational issues, I actually think that's the way that you're going to start to rebuild some confidence in the ability to work together. I don't think we're in a place where singular US pressure on China in a bilateral setting is the most effective way to change China's behavior. China very much wants to be part of the global community. They very much want to have open and productive trade relations with Europe, with Asia. I think the more it's the United States working in concert with like-minded countries to set rules of the road together. China can be part of that process. China was not part of the process 50 years ago in writing the rules. They would be in writing the rules of the future. So these are not either or questions. And I actually think, not that the Chinese ask for my domestic economic advice, that it's in the best interest of China's economy to do things that way, because the increasing kind of clampdown on China's society and economy are ultimately not going to help it take the next step, where, having broken out of extreme poverty, they're headed towards a real crisis as their large retirement age population retires, with a younger workforce that's smaller in number, and a real middle class crunch with people trying to maintain their standard of living. So it actually, it may not be what they envision in terms of how to have maximum control domestically, but in terms of the best interests of their economic future, and I think therefore the people, the things I'm saying are in their interest.
Thank you. And we do have many people listening. And so sometimes the best advice is that which is not directly solicited. I'm going to turn to, we have many questions here. I'm going to turn to Megan Green first, who's going to ask her question, and unmute first.
Yeah, thanks so much. I wanted to ask about macroeconomic policy, Secretary Lew, because it seems like maybe we've all learned, as countries at least, that we can borrow as much as we want, or way more than we thought we could before, without any real backup in interest rates. Crowding out seems to be a thing of the past. So first of all, I'm wondering if that's the right lesson to be learning. And then secondly, I'm wondering, for your perspective, particularly from your seat in private equity, whether that rule works for governments, but actually could be a problem For the corporate sector, we were all worried about leverage in the corporate sector before this crisis, and also more importantly, in private markets, might the rooster or the hens come home to roost in the private markets?
So I don't know if it shows my age, but I'm one of the few people who still says we have to pay attention to the overall fiscal picture. It's not popular in the Republican Party, who did tax cut without paying for it. It's not so popular with the progressive end of the Democratic Party, where at some level people are saying the laws of economics have changed. I think for the moment, we're not in a terribly dangerous position, because you look at interest rates, we have negative real interest rates. We're looking at a sustained period of low interest rates. It's going to take a while for interest rates to really create the kind of pressure of debt sustainability. You know, you look at US government projections of what interest rates will be for the cost of servicing the debt. They still assume that they're going to be in the 3 to 4% range over time. I don't know a lot of people who think that's going to be anytime soon. You know, if we could see 2% or 2.5% interest rates, that would be, you know, a pretty dramatic change from the near zero that we've all gotten accustomed to. I think, you know, you look at debt sustainability rules. I believe that you have to look at not just what percentage of GDP debt is, but what is the capacity to service the debt based on both the size of your economy and interest rates. And the cost of servicing the debt has been coming down, at least in the United States, even as the debt has been growing, because the interest rate environment has been, you know, so low. I wouldn't bet that it stays that way for 30 years. You know, I think it's a good thing that the debt's been stretched out a little bit. We were doing that after the financial crisis, when it had really the term of debt had shrunk during the peak of the crisis. There's a limit to how much you can stretch it out. People say, why don't you finance the whole debt at 30 years? Well, you need a T-bill market that works in a 30, 60, 90 day, you know, 1, 2, 3, 5, 10, 20-year market. You need a healthy market in all the maturities. So you can't go to all 30-year debt. I don't know how much it can be stretched out, but a little bit more would obviously lock in some of the sustainability. You know, my view of macroeconomics hasn't actually changed that much. You know, when the economy is doing well, is the time to kind of pay for what you're doing. And when the economy is weak, it's the time to look the other way and say, we're going to pay for this later. I think it was right at the height of COVID to not be wedded to kind of conservative notions of how much debt we could add. I think it's right now, as Congress is looking at paying for the Build Back Better program, to insist that it be paid for. I actually think it's pretty historic that this is going to be paid for. You know, people are going to argue, are the offsets real? They're going to be predominantly real. If they're not real on the margin, it doesn't change the fact that the commitment is to pay for it, the intention is to pay for it. And I think there's as good a chance they're going to overpay for it as underpay for it. So I don't think that the fact that debt built up during the COVID crisis is a reason not to invest now in the future and to pay for it. I would not be saying that if it was all being put on the debt. You know, so, you know, when is the time to reduce the deficit? I think we have to get fully back on our feet from COVID. We have to deal with some of these legacy problems that have been neglected for a very long time. And I think, you know, just coming back to the first conversation that Leslie and I had, if we come out of this legislative period with important initiatives like, you know, preschool for all kids, you know, like a $555 billion climate investment program, you know, and many other important things, any one of which would have been considered enormous on its own. You know, the fact that there's more work to do, you know, will give people reasons to run for office going forward. As a fiscal matter, I think we're a long way away from there being a consensus that this is the moment to actually start reducing the deficit. I think that, you know, my experience is you don't have that political coming together until the market starts to send signals either in terms of the price of what it costs to borrow or the availability of capital for private investment. And we're just not seeing that yet. In terms of your question about private markets, we are seeing valuations in private markets at pretty astronomical levels. I know, as somebody who spends a lot of my day looking at opportunities to invest, we insist on maintaining discipline and not assuming that this goes on forever, that multiples will grow forever, that capital will be free forever. I don't know when things come home to roost for those who have been less careful. You're asking, will it happen? I just saw in the news this morning, the U.S. markets were up 0.5% before the trading opened today. It still seems a little frothy in public markets to me. Corrections happen, and they don't always happen in a neat way, but they don't have to happen in a terribly messy way. There's every warning sign on the horizon that interest rates are going to go up in the next 2 years. That's just part of how people have to think about what they invest in now in terms of what future values are.
Thank you, Secretary Lew. I'm going to come to Hugh Jenkins in a moment. I just did want to say, though, on your comment about, it should be spent and it should be paid for, and it is being paid for. I felt quite nervous when I woke up this morning to Larry Summers' tweet saying it's being paid for without many of us who are doing quite well, and we're actually getting a tax break. So I wasn't sure.
That's a different issue. I totally agree. I mean, I think that the low-hanging fruit that would have really been important tax reform was left on the tree. Bringing the individual rate back to where it was before the Trump tax cuts, taking the corporate rate from 21% to 25%, when I was at the Treasury Department, what corporate leaders were asking for was 25%, and raising the capital gains rate just a little bit. That's all still there to be done. I think it's wrong to say that they're not doing anything. They do have a significant surtax on very high earners. The thresholds are higher than I would have put in. I would have gone with what the administration proposed. The corporate minimum tax is an alternate way to get at companies that are avoiding taxation entirely. Capital gains, they kind of didn't do a heck of a lot. What I tell people who lament about many of the spending provisions being very short term, I say, well, you don't have to worry about where to look to pay for extending them, because a lot of that, those policies are still there. So I don't think these discussions end with the enactment of this bill. In a year, 2 years, 3 years, when things like the child credit expire, people are going to be looking for ways to pay for them. And I do agree it would have been better to do more now. But there is quite a lot being done. And, I look to the part of the glass that's half full, I guess.
Thank you. We'll come to you, Hugh Jenkins. Please do ask your question.
Thank you, Leslie. And thank you, Secretary Lew, for taking the time today. Are you concerned that increased use of access to the dollar payment system as a sanction could actually result in undermining the dollar and thus sort of weakening US hegemony?
Look, I think the value to the United States of the dollar being the world's reserve currency is enormous, both in terms of our economic well-being and in terms of our strategic strength. The truth of the matter is the only reason that our sanctions have the power they have is that everybody wants to have access to US markets. Everybody wants to be able to do business with the dollar. And that gives you the ability to have a sanctions regime that others are willing to comply with. I don't think it's a binary question of does it weaken the dollar as the reserve currency or not. I think if you use sanctions in a strategic way, it doesn't weaken the dollar. If you use sanctions in consultation with other countries, keeping unilateral action to a minimum, not starting with unilateral action. I think if you're careful in how you design them, if you don't use them to make just political rhetorical points, but to accomplish driving policy in another country towards an end that most countries agree on, I don't think that there will be any abandonment of the dollar. I think over the last few years, we've seen an accelerating, I mean, under the Trump administration, we saw an accelerating use of US power in a way that scared a lot of countries, that we weren't necessarily doing that. In fairness, I heard a lot from my European counterparts that it was already an issue during previous administrations. I could always say to my counterparts, when they said that the extraterritorial reach of US sanctions was a problem, well, you're looking at a case where there was repeated tax fraud, or you're looking at a case where there was specific, intentional, repeated evasion of sanctions regimes to provide X, Y, or Z to a sanctioned party that we both agreed to sanction. When you can't justify what you're doing on that basis, it weakens the confidence that you're the partner you promised to be. I think we're going to get back to a place where there's more confidence in how we do it. But I do think it's a little worrisome that the plumbing has been put in place to make it easier to work around the United States. Interestingly, it hasn't been used that way to a great extent. But when European countries came together in the case of US withdrawing from the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action on Iran nuclear weapons, they came together to say, we can have what are called cutout operations, where you can do business without touching the United States, not be sanctioned by the United States. Now, they didn't use that mechanism. They didn't actually put it into effect because they knew that there'd be consequence in terms of access to US markets in some retaliatory way. We see increasing use of electronic payment, the cryptocurrency. I don't think it's meaningfully competing with the dollar, but just as a mechanism, if you decide the risk of dollars is high and the risk of crypto is worth taking, that balance can technically shift. So I think it's a bit of a kind of moment in time where we have to be better about figuring out how our sanctions can reach into some of these new technologies. But we also have to do what I have said for some time, is take a step back and use our sanctions strategically, not drop them, not say that we don't have a right to do them, but to have it be in a strategic way where the incentive is not changed to use the dollar. Now, I'm told by people who've worried about this for some time that these warnings were made decades ago and they haven't come to pass. I've been very careful not to say the sky is falling, because I don't think there's anything on the horizon that competes with the dollar as the world's reserve currency or the basic medium for most global commerce. But I do think that how we conduct ourselves and our use of our extraordinary power has a bearing on whether that will be true 20 and 30 years from now. And my view is, if you can take the special position of the US dollar as the world's reserve currency and extend its life for 25 or 50 or 75 years, that's a pretty good day's work. And I think using your sanctions more effectively will make that more likely.
We have a question from Janet Whitaker. I'm going to read it out for her. She's based in Washington, senior counsel with Clifford Chance. Janet writes, different countries are charting different paths towards net zero. For example, the EU is placing a significant focus on carbon pricing, and it looks as though the United States will for now focus on regulation and innovation. Can these approaches be reconciled, or are we heading towards inevitable friction?
Well, I think countries are inevitably going to take different paths to meet a goal as challenging as carbon neutrality. I think even within countries, we see there's a step forward, a step back, that it's not easy to form a lasting consensus. Australia put carbon pricing in, and then almost immediately in the next cycle reversed it, back 8 or so years ago. I think there's going to be some variation in how countries deal with it. I think the most important thing is agreeing on the goal and to having tools that are broadly accepted as being effective, and to minimizing the kind of competitive spillover that hurts the global economy. I wish that carbon pricing was something you could debate in the United States and reach a positive outcome on. I've thought that for 30 years, but it hasn't happened. I've been part of administrations that tried, and it didn't succeed because that's not where the kind of political will was in the United States. That doesn't mean we should be let off the hook in terms of meeting our goal. We have to find other mechanisms to do it, or indirect ways to get at those kinds of incentives. I think the more flexibility different countries have to meet climate goals in ways that are consistent with domestic ideological and political values, the more likely we are to succeed. So I think we need to be cognizant of the differences, but not be afraid of it.
We're coming to the end of our time, but I'm going to have two people ask their questions together, one and then the next, and then we'll come back to you, Secretary Lew. Richard Castle first, and then Jong-Yuan Liu. Richard, if you'd like to go ahead.
I've been listening to a very interesting chat about US foreign policy and economic opportunities. Well, what I want to ask is that in terms of Joe Biden and his impetus with the AUKUS partnership with Australia and the United Kingdom, what sort of policy initiatives or economic opportunities will this AUKUS partnership give rise to? And then effectively, what sort of stocks should I be buying that will be profiting from AUKUS?
I never give stock advice, so
We'll take one more question before you answer that, because we're coming to Jong-Yuan Liu.
Yeah, thank you very much, Secretary Lew, and for your insight, and many thanks to Dr. Vinjamuri for the very relevant questions. My question actually touched upon the issue of digital currency and the digital economy with specific regards to the impact on U.S. sanctions. During your tenure as Secretary of the Treasury, you very wisely warned us and the U.S. government about the negative consequences of potential overuse of sanctions. And recently, the Treasury Department also concluded its review of sanctions, and the conclusion is to shift away from using sanctions too much, which is very much in line with your vision when you were holding office. So I'm just curious, from your perspective, how do the digital economy and digital currencies specifically challenge the implementation of U.S. sanctions going forward? And from your perspective, are state-sponsored digital currencies, such as central bank digital currencies, potentially more challenging to the U.S., or are the cryptocurrencies launched by the private sector more challenging? Thank you very much.
I don't think at the moment either state-sponsored or private cryptocurrencies are challenging the dollar's role in a meaningful way. Their use is growing, but as a percentage of total commerce, it's not pushing the dollar aside, and certainly it's not becoming a medium for reserve currencies. For sovereign reserves of currencies. The thing about digital sovereign currencies that it's important to remember is they're fundamentally no different than traditional sovereign currencies. They are as attractive as a medium of storage of value or commerce digitally as they are in the real economy. there's a reason why other currencies haven't pushed the dollar aside. The stability of the dollar, the stability of US treasuries, the stability of the US economy and its resilience, and our political system's ability to bounce back from even major crises, all contribute to why the dollar is as strong a player in the global economy as it is. You know, there's been a lot of focus on China's developing a digital currency as, is it a threat to the dollar? My own view is, you know, China's not really any more ready to have its digital currency become a world reserve currency than it was for the traditional RMB. You know, it would require a degree of openness and full convertibility that, you know, means giving up some control. They got far enough to get into this SDR basket of the IMF, but they're not yet at a place where it's fully open and fully convertible. I think if I look at what China's doing, there's really two things that I see as the true real motivation. One is cryptocurrency use in China was growing, and that meant that there was visibility into transactions being concentrated in those cryptocurrency medium, and in the desire to maintain government visibility, they said, we'd rather have that be in an RMB denominated cryptocurrency, not in the private sector. And that gives the government the information both at a meta level and at a more specific level. The second, it gets back to plumbing. It's not about today, but it's at some point in the future, if there is a policy drive to avoid having a transaction touch the United States, having there be easier commerce in a cryptocurrency becomes a way to potentially do business without touching the dollar or US shores. I don't think that is a widespread practice right now. You're seeing more oil traded in RMB, but it's not becoming the basic medium of global currency yet. I would just make one clarification in terms of what you said about my view and the administration's strategic review. It's not to say that sanctions shouldn't be used. It's not to say that they're not an important tool. It's to say that they need to be used carefully. They need to be used strategically. And I actually think that makes them more effective in the future, which is what I think the goal of a sanctions policy should be: accomplish your most important goals today and have the tool in the future. And I must apologize, I've run out of time. And since I wasn't going to give any market advice to Hugh, maybe it's just as well.
Secretary Lew, we won't keep you. This has been a tremendous honor, a pleasure to have you on such a wide-ranging conversation, from everything to vaccine distribution, climate change, sanctions, US-China relations. I think our audience especially appreciates your comments about the plumbing, putting the plumbing in place, because for many years during the Trump administration, it was sort of the daily conversation was how to work around the United States and to prepare perhaps from America's departure from the global scene. You reassure us that that's not what we're seeing. That's not what's likely to happen. I think we all hope that that's the case. I tend to agree largely with you. But regardless, this has been illuminating and it's been a real honor. So thank you for joining us, and thank you to all of you for your questions and for staying with us.
Thanks, good to be with you.